My name is Richard Lemarchand and I'm a game designer. I was very lucky to work for more than 20 years in the mainstream of the game industry, including stints at Crystal Dynamics and at Naughty Dog, where I was the lead or the co-lead game designer on the first 3 Uncharted games for PlayStation 3. I now am an associate professor in the USC Games program at the University of Southern California here in Los Angeles. I think that they might have been more diverse and more personal. I think that I'm a big believer that any kind of constraint can aid a design, and working in a commercial art form like the mainstream of video games, obviously the constraints of the market are key considerations in the design of whatever we're making, and these are multitudinous, these constraints. There might be everything from a consideration of the ages and therefore the sort of subject matter of a game, the ages of the audience and what certain subject matter is appropriate for. There might be certain constraints that we might view as to do with ability or even disability. You know, certainly an understanding of the physicality of our players and whether they have fine motor skills in their thumbs or whether they have motor skills in their bodies, the ability to stand, the ability to hear. These are all the kinds of constraints that might come to bear on the design of a game. But unfortunately, certainly in the earlier part of my career, we would often receive constraints from the people in charge of the considering the commercial aspects of a game production that I believe did not accurately reflect the audience or perhaps the potential audience for our games. So as I was coming up, the received wisdom was that video games were predominantly played by men and boys in a certain age range, from kind of maybe tweens or younger through to early 20s. And I think that that drove the video game industry towards certain kinds of representation, particularly in the player characters and the characters in the game allied closely to the player character. For many years, the received wisdom was that those characters all had to be men or boys, because men and boys in the audience of players would only accept those characters. I think it's always been the case that vast numbers of women and girls were playing these games, and that they would have welcomed representation of characters that they could relate to more directly. I'm also a big believer in the idea that it is incorrect to say that men and boys uniformly prefer not to play as characters who are women and girls. And so, yeah, I think this impacted, as I look back across my career, the games that I worked on somewhat. However, I was very fortunate. I worked on games that had something of a diversity of representation. People have their views changed or sometimes perhaps reinforced by all of the culture that they consume, including by video games and other kinds of games like board games and card games. I think when we see a product of culture, the symbols, the representations that we see there do build an internalized understanding on our parts of how we stand in relation to culture, and how culture, in the main, how the society writ large relates to us. So I think it's undeniable that, yeah, this is a major mechanism by which the relationship between the individual and society at large is forged, formed, and reinforced. I think think it's possible in a few sentences to summarize the character of these of any kind of changes or reinforcements that might be taking place, because you would have to consider the whole plethora of different types of games. However, having been at GDC last week and having attended a talk by my friend, the game designer and writer Steve Curran, about gun violence in games, wherein Steve presented statistics about the vast preponderance of gun violence in video games, and having also been to another talk by the game designer and engineer Brie Code, who worked for many years at Ubisoft, who gave a very compelling talk about alternative models of human emotional behavior and social behavior that are not currently reflected in the interaction patterns that we see in game design. In particular, she identified a newly recognized psychological phenomenon called tend and befriend that correlates the release of dopamine in the brain to patterns of social activity. These two ideas put together make me think that yes, the game industry, while has historically had a problem with certain types of behavior that we could consider to be negative or antisocial, to be reinforced by both the mechanics and the narratives of the games, while other kinds of behavior that we might see as being more socially and individually positivistic around building strong social relations of collaboration and mutual emotional support are not yet being supported by certain aspects of game culture. I do think that we've made tremendous strides over the last 10 to 20 years around this, and that year on year we're seeing more and more games that do less of the former and more of the latter. In my time in the game industry, I've worked on some games that we might see more as games aimed at kids, where the core mechanics of the games were less around violent conflict and more to do with a kind of cartoony magical combat, where it seems more like the enemies are being magicked away rather than killed. That was a game called Pandemonium that I worked on in the earlier part of my career. However, not across the remaining arc of my career in the mainstream of the game industry did I work on a game with similar non-violent character until I joined the University of Southern California. My first research game, which I ultimately did not ship, but which I worked on for a couple of years, was a game called Between Hotel, which was a game about the relationship between domestic space and our interiority, our emotional lives and our inner intellectual lives. And this was a game that we might call an experiential game. It was a game about exploring a space that seemed like a sequence of hotel rooms or perhaps a sprawling apartment complex where the rooms were generated procedurally. And where you encountered certain items from everyday life that had certain kinds of emotional resonance. So once I was at liberty to explore whatever kind of game design that I wished, once I joined a university and had the freedom afforded to academics, I immediately went towards these modes of game design. And my last two projects, the virtual reality project The Meadow and my current project, currently untitled but with the working title of Min-Max, are both similar experiential games that are not oriented around any kind of fighting, but which instead are oriented towards an exploration of a space of possible experience. I was constantly addressing issues of representation around gender, ethnicity, and perhaps somewhat around issues of perhaps sexual orientation. Certainly in the course of creating the Uncharted games, we had ongoing discussions to make sure that we were doing service to the world and to culture at large by not hitting any political notes incorrectly. The Uncharted games are in large part inspired by a kind of contemporary reinvention of the pulp adventure genre, leading back through the Indiana Jones films of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and back further towards Lucas and Spielberg's source material in the 1930s and the 1940s. We were always aware that there was potentially a kind of colonialist inheritance to those kinds of adventures, with people from the West travelling to parts of the developing world to have adventures there. And we were aware that sometimes that led to politically problematic either representations of people or situations that, you know, we might consider tainted with colonialist exploitation. And so we worked very hard in all of our design and narrative conversations to make sure that we were not falling foul of these kinds of potential problems. And by and large, I think we did okay. We may have made the occasional misstep, perhaps around a certain lack of diversity in the first game, but in the second and third games we worked hard to readdress those issues, and I think our games were well received because of it, I would hope. Yeah, sure. In the first game, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, there was a relatively small cast of central characters, and their ethnicity was, especially in the core cohort of the three main protagonists, they were all Caucasian. Whereas the enemies that you encountered in the game, who were meant to be a hired mercenary army, sourced from mercenaries originating all around the world, from every country, from every continent at least, and we intended for the mercenaries to seem diverse in their ethnic makeup. But I think that we misjudged somewhat the balance of apparent ethnicities among those enemies, and some people perceived them as being disproportionately composed of people of colour, which was not something that we intended. So in the latter games we redressed that balance. We made sure that it was more obvious that the antagonists in the game, the enemies that you encountered, had many national and ethnic origins. In the Uncharted series, Nathan Drake is intended to be a good-hearted person who has kind of a roguish streak. So somebody who might bend or break the rules to get what he wants, but is inherently a person with a strong ethical principle and a large amount of integrity, and also whom rather being driven by greed, he's really driven by a kind of intellectual curiosity. So I would say that the Uncharted games are actually not antisocial. At least within the parameters of what I've just described. I guess it depends on how you feel about bending or breaking the rules. The previous major game series that I worked on, Soul Reaver, I suppose we might see that somewhat through a lens of anti-sociability. The Soul Reaver games are gothic horror games based on a kind of Gnostic myth. Their chief influences were John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, about the fall of Satan from heaven to become, Lord and ruler of the underworld. And they're also rooted in Gnostic stories about a false god who claims to be, who is the creator of the world, but who is not the true god, who is flawed. Raziel, the hero of these games, has at one time was an intensely loyal lieutenant of the vampire who has risen to become ruler of the world. The vampire is known as Cain, not coincidentally named for the biblical Cain, one of the first wrongdoers in the Bible. And Raziel's story is a story of struggle against the forces that I just described. I think that we might identify Raziel's quest as a kind of existential one. Another major influence for the game series was German expressionist film of the 1920s, and in that time, philosophically, existentialism was kind of coming into formation in European continental philosophy. So there is a kind of moral, ethical argument there to do with individual liberty and fealty to groups, and we might see that as being perhaps about issues of anti-sociability. By and large, I consider that the arts and literature have an instrumental role to play in the formation of an ethical and moral understanding on the part of culture at large. And as someone who at least strives to be an ethical, moral person with a strong sense of integrity, I've always wanted my artistic work to reflect those values. So I guess that's a long way of saying no, not really. There's certainly been lots of academic research and some market research that has had a big influence on me as a game designer. As someone who joined the game industry at a time when there really wasn't a games academy, and who has keenly followed the release of each new textbook or monograph on video games and other kinds of non-digital games and their design, and as someone who has eagerly read many academic papers studying game development, I can't really begin to summarize the impact that this work has had on my game design practice. I could mention one or two key things. I think that the paper Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics by Robin Haneke, Marc LeBlanc and Robert Zubek had a major influence on me in giving me a model for game design that freed me from what is sometimes called the tyranny of fun. Game designers in the first half of my career would often bandy the word fun about as a kind of holy grail for game design without ever really interrogating that term to find out what they thought it to mean and what else it could mean. The MDA model opens us up to consider other kinds of emotional, intellectual and otherwise phenomenological impact that a game could have on a person, thereby expanding the design possibility space for games. Another paper that had a big impact on me was Hegemony of Play by the feminist game design collective Ludica, which included the director of the USC Games program, Tracy Fullerton, my friend and dear colleague here, which critiqued game design practice in the way that some of your questions invite us to look at it, by considering who is included in the design considerations and who might be being excluded. And the Hegemony of Play as a paper proposed that there are large market segments going unserved by current game design mores in the industry and embedded in culture. I think that paper has had a big impact, and certainly through the work of people like Tracy Fullerton and her mentorship of Genova Chen, Kelly Santiago of That Game Company, this has led to a reciprocal impact on the market with the creation of games like the 2012 Game of the Year Journey.
So, final question. In the light of what we talked about here with the need for knowledge sharing, the need for personal expression and awareness of diversity, for example, do you think that kind of your first answer, which was about kind of free of market restraints, what you would make, do you think that would be a common answer for other developers?
Do I think that my first answer about being free of constraints would be a common answer for all developers? I think that most creative people who work in a commercial space would give a kind of complicated answer if you ask them what would it be like to be free of commercial constraints. I have a sense that the very best practitioners of the world, in the world, in any form, whether it's the writing of a video game or a novel, are already working independently of commercial constraints. I think when a great pop author, say Stephen King, sits down to write, they're thinking artistically first and only of the market in a tertiary kind of way. So it's difficult because, of course, there's another answer that says that great progress happens in an art form when people shrug off history and shrug off commercial constraints. You know, we might think of the Renaissance in black filmmaking in the United States from the 80s and 90s. I'm a big believer in the sense that quality will out. But at the same time, I do know that very often great works get made and then languish. They don't connect with their audiences because they're not afforded the resources provided by the sales and marketing and PR operations of major commercial entities. So it's difficult. I think that as time goes by, the best publishers, the best developers are giving their best designers and developers increasingly more freedom to pursue their own interests, to activate their own voices. And I hope that is a trend that continues, because I believe it benefits us all. I think audiences of players connect to authenticity, they connect to uniqueness and individuality, to true stories that they can recognize from somebody else's life, even if it's coming through a fantastical or a playful milieu. And so I think it will help everyone as the form is increasingly liberated from our old ideas about who is playing games and who is making games.